Hi there guys, we're Micromundo, a small furniture design and construction studio here in Barcelona, and we're going to continue our series of videos on the Virutex FR160P plunge router combined with their PL11 dovetailing jig. Okay, so imagine for example that you have this installed. We have it screwed to a piece of chipboard, so that you can then lift it wherever you want and just clamp the whole unit to whatever work surface suits you. Depends sometimes on the size of the piece that you want to work on, where you want to install it. So it's important, as I mentioned, to have the correct comb and copying bit and dovetailing bit installed. This is what you get from the company. So it comes, this is the only complete kit we have. It's not the one I'm going to show today, but they're essentially all the same. This comb is the 16mm copying piece, spacers, and they give you a little depth setting tool I'll explain in a moment with every one of these kits. So the interesting thing with this, I suppose, is that you get everything you need all in one go, and explains your offset. But a couple of things that, you see there's no instruction beyond this. There's nothing that really would tell you how it works if you had never done it before. So I'm going to try and lay that out so that you don't make some of the mistakes that we did at the beginning. Okay, the key thing would be to set your depth. So I've got the router plugged in, but I'm not going to press any of the buttons here, so this is still safe. You have your bit protruding here. Now the important thing with this is your shank has to be at least 3/4 of its length inside the collet of the router. Okay, or it may shear or come loose. It'll probably destroy the comb at least, and it may do damage to the collet itself. And if you're really unlucky, it may come out and do you some harm. It'll give you a scare anyway, a flag as we would say in Scotland. So the thing with this is you set your piece here, and your guide will tell you roughly how many millimeters it protrudes from the base of the router, if you like, but roughly how strong you see it go. It says lazo fuerte to lazo flojo. It's like strong to weak joint, if you like. Now I do this kind of by eye. It's one of these things you kind of have to try for yourself, because the material I'm going to be demonstrating today is actually MDF. You'll find one of your limitations might be what the material itself can take. In a hardwood, that wouldn't maybe be a consideration. With softwood, what you may find is that the teeth of the dovetail may split or chip off completely. Okay, so how do you set this up? Okay, I've got a couple of test pieces here that I'll show how this works. The important thing is that when you go to set your router on the base, you have to think very, very carefully about the thickness of the piece you're working to. This is really what you have to go on, because the comb itself, if you have the correct copying bit installed and you install it, safely when you go to start routing, will control the router almost completely. As long as you hold it steady, it can't really go anywhere but into the teeth of the comb. There you go. So far, so good. If you set the depth wrongly, which we did a couple of times initially, I'm not going to go into detail about that. It's a little bit embarrassing. We cut into the base, if you like, beneath the comb, because I was focused on a lot of things. You can just see this here. You can just see it. I've marked these with a permanent marker so that I could see where I had done this. So I could see if there were any new cuts. This was at the very, very beginning because there was no video to explain it. Which is a bit of a limitation for us. So just so you're not in this position, I'm going to show you how you would set this up. Now, because I'm doing this with MDF, because MDF is cheaper than wood, just to get the idea, this is, can't emphasize enough, this is not what you would normally be doing. The first step is to position your horizontal piece, which is where you're going to cut your grooves for your dovetail. Now, okay, I'm describing this as a dovetail, and that, what you produce with a dovetailing jig is not technically a dovetail anyway. It's really a false dovetail, but let's not go into that. So you position it loosely. Obviously, you have to be able to, move it back and forward a little bit. and then your vertical piece goes in and faces it. What do you do with this? Okay, it goes up and it sort of rests on the underside here of the comb. Okay, now the key thing will be when you go to tighten this a little bit to secure your horizontal piece, that it's very, very snug at the end and flush. Okay, so once you get that more or less, then you can you have to work with these. You can't go and tighten one completely. You have to kind of work back and forward. The key thing is it has to be flush at both ends, or they won't align properly, and they'll try and make one another squint when you go to hammer them together. You probably noticed that I had this tape on the back side of the piece which is going to be producing the pegs. This is a tip I got in another video that is brilliant actually. It's there to produce to reduce tear out. When the router goes in to the piece, it enters the piece on this side where I am, and there you tend to have no problem. Provided your bit is reasonably sharp, you're not working with blunt bits, that's your starting point, you'll usually find you don't get any tearing or any damage to the piece unless it's a very, very sensitive veneer or something. But on the back side of the cut, that's where you'll get your tear out as it leaves the piece at high speed. So for this case, I did it because I wanted to show this in practice, but with MDF you wouldn't necessarily get this anyway. If you've got them very, very snug, it may not happen because it bites into the front side of the horizontal piece at 90 degrees, and you may find that it doesn't cause any tear out at all, if you're lucky. Okay, so if you've got your work pieces in place, now normally these are quite small pieces we're working with here, but this whole part of the base actually should hold whatever you're working with in place. It's important that these pieces are flat, okay? This may be, you know, this is common sense stuff, I'm not talking about rocket science, but if you put in anything that's curved or has any kind of relief, this base is quite rough on the underside. This is another point actually. I think at one point I ran a file over the underside edge here all the way around, particularly around where these handles are to tighten the vertical piece. Because you do this in a hurry and you rotate your hand too quickly. The underside here was where it had been cast. I suppose it's cast aluminium. Would be this is where you can cut yourself. So I recommend that when you get it, check that there are no rough edges here on the underside. And if there's anything a little bit sharp, just grind it down, run a Dremel over it, or use a file. I would do it around the whole edge. It's not going to affect anything about how it holds the workpiece because it's not functional, that part. This whole outer edge does nothing. The only part that interests you here is that this base isn't interfered with. There's nothing protruding through these screw holes where you put the comb in from the backside, and that you don't fiddle with any of the other screws or handles. None of that. I wouldn't interfere with any of that, but the underside edge I would take care of. Okay, so the important thing with this is to be very, very careful. As you see, I always work with this router. I always have a base so that you can position and tighten your bit and have it resting on a work surface that's stable. I think this is very important because you don't want any instability. You don't want this getting knocked. It'll potentially change the depth, loosen the bit, or damage the collet. And you don't want any of those things to happen when you've got a route like this on the go. So place it through, and you'll see that there's a little bit of play, a little bit of freedom with the piece that you're working with. You've got a little bit of space there, which is fair enough. Okay. The other thing you'll find with this, you'll notice automatically that it's I'm working the wrong way around. This is not that I'm doing something foolish here. It's just that this back edge piece here, this support, I suppose there's a spine of support of some kind to allow you to tighten, but this I don't think was well thought out at all, because you can't actually use the router the correct way around. Your extraction, it comes straight out the back of the machine, and if you were to turn it right the way around, as I attempted to do the first time I routed like this, you'll find that it doesn't actually fit. So you could work without extraction, which I don't recommend, because motors produce sparks and you're working with very, very fine dust, and also you're going to have to breathe it in and it's going to settle on all your gear around the workshop. The only alternative I can see is that you turn the router around. If you had a smaller router for this, if you're working with a different router and maybe it was the extraction was angled, you'd find some other way of making this work. But I've not found an alternative myself. This is slightly annoying because it means you've got to use your thumb to activate this small inner switch, and it's not quite as comfortable. The angle is not comfortable really to route, but these are details. Incidentally, as I mentioned in the other video, these nuts here can be used to tighten or to lock, if you like, the tool in place in addition to the locking lever. Now I'm going to cut one dovetail here, so I'm not really too fussed. But if you were going to repeat this operation, you were going to cut lots the same, maybe building boxes or creating drawers or whatever it is, and you want them all identical, I recommend locking this. The problem you'll usually have, as I probably mentioned at the time in the other video, is that on the underside here you'll find any spanner or wrench will allow you to tighten to the lower nut. But the upper one, there's not an awful lot of space here between the casing, the edge of the plastic casing of the chassis, and the nut itself, which is irritating. Obviously that's very, very irritating because I've not found a convenient spanner or wrench that isn't curved and fits in there neatly. What would I recommend? Buy a cheap spanner for the purpose that fits the nut perfectly and grind the edges straight so that they fit. Okay. What does a spanner cost? Nothing. You can get one for a few euros and just grind it and then keep it in your toolbox with it, so you always know you have it to hand. It's not going to affect anything, I wouldn't have thought, for the amount of tightening you're going to have to do here. So let's go ahead and cut this. One thing you'll probably notice when I bite into this and as I work along the tooth, the teeth of the comb, you'll probably notice that I am inclined to lean to the right. I'm right-handed, and that'll probably mean that I'm trying to follow the comb, and I'm putting more pressure to the right, I suppose. Almost every action we do right-handed people or left-handed, the opposite way around, we'll put a lot more force, if you like, into that direction. Either way, with this, I always find you have to make a double cut. So you cut the main bulk of the material out, and then you stop completely, as you'll see in the video, go back to the start, and just tidy the joint up. Because that's the thing with a dovetail like this, a machined dovetail on a jig, it has to fit together very, very well, as any dovetail does. Or there'll be an uneven distribution of force when you go to hammer it. One part will be thicker than another and it will just crack. I've not had much experience of that really. In general, it's worked very, very well. So I always make a second cut. In hardwoods, this is particularly important because the important thing with this is, unlike with a straight bit or some types of bit where you can do one pass and then drop down with the router and make a second pass to cut out more material. With this, you've got to do it straight away. You've got to do it all at once. Because of the shape of the bit, you can't do it bit by bit. Because if you go halfway down, obviously the bit's not the same shape. The cut rather wouldn't be the same shape. Because the bit's not in the same position because of the shape of a dovetailing bit. So your bit has to be sharp, it has to be good quality, and you've got to make it all, do the cut all in one go. So this would be the thing, making two passes at it is the equivalent of that, because you'll probably find it's a bit of a strain to go right round at once. If you're in a hurry, or you pick up the technique really, really well, you get it under control, you may be fine, you can do it in one go. Perfectly possible. Okay, again, I always emphasize this because MDF dust is all dust. All dust really is bad for your health, and I always recommend this. The same things I'm going to say in every video. Eye protection, you get one set of eyes. Good ear defenders, you get one set of ears and one set of lungs, okay? Particularly with MDF dust, I find it's aggressive, so I always recommend this. I wouldn't even make any shortcuts without it. Okay, let's give it a go. Make sure you're clear. Okay, everything's in position. Okay, it's not bad. Not bad. Okay, let's run it again. Second pass. Second pass. Okay, so that's two passes then. We've run around. Now, I would emphasise that for the purposes of this video, I've used MDF, and it has actually caused a bit of front edge chipping there, which isn't ideal. But you would be doing this in a hardwood. If you wanted, you could tape the front edge too. So let's take a look at the result. Let's see what the deal is with this. Okay, now for the purposes of this, I've used black and, oh, yeah, that's just the springs. They tighten sometimes and pop up inside the housing. Not a bad result there. Very, very neat, you see, in MDF, and it hasn't started to crack here. What you can do with this is you can run fine sandpaper just very, very quickly around the inside edge just to tidy that up. Because when the bit goes in, what it does is it drives a little bit of material up. It's probably not going to affect the actual joint because it's not in contact with where the pegs are going to be going. But what you'll maybe find is on the inside edge, it'll maybe be visible. It depends. So you see there's a little bit of chipping here in the front edge. But remember, MDF is what it is. It's for this purpose. It's not for making dovetails really. So you see as you tear this off, you've got to pull up the way a little bit to get this to come off. You'll see that you've got a very, very neat cut there. There's absolutely no tear on that side. This is going to be the visible side. So if you imagine, it's not really too worrying to you if there's a little bit of chipping on that inside edge there. If it's inside a box or inside a drawer, you could argue, who cares, okay? So let's just knock it together and see what happens. With this, it sort of depends on what it is you're working on, but you take the pieces out and flip them round, you'll notice. So if you were cutting this as your vertical piece, it's giving you your pegs, they were this way round, weren't they? Okay, and this is sitting flat in the piece. What do? Flip this one this way, and this one this way, and they should match neatly and be flush at both ends, provided you've calculated it properly. What we'll probably do with this is lay them down flat. Okay, it depends what you're trying to knock together, but give it a little knock. You hear that? It should be that there's no empty space for it to knock against. And you can see the result is actually very, very tidy. Occasionally what will happen is if your top edge isn't perfectly aligned, you'll find there's a little bit of space at one end of the pegs that there isn't at the other. And you go, well, what do I do about that? Just make sure that it's perfectly flush. The edges have to tie up to begin with. You know, if you put them against a flat surface or you tie them up with a square and you see that they're not 100% flush, well, this can't perform miracles either. That's kind of up to you. But you see on this edge, it's perfectly flush there, almost perfectly flush there. You know, yeah, I would say it's more or less. A very, very light sand will tidy that up. And here you'll be putting glue into this. In the process with the glue, what you can do is you can put in a little bit of sawdust. And then when you give it this face, it's sand, it'll be barely visible. Obviously, I've done this in two different materials so you can see how neatly the shape has been cut. That corner, you see, that peg has come together beautifully. Okay, so that's the basic idea. This is another sample that I made just to get the idea, a little practice for this. This is the same MDF, but it happened to have an oak veneer. Can't remember what this project was exactly, but this was lying around, so I thought I'd make use of it. If you decided you want to do this with MDF, you can route it quite successfully. For example, the box that I made for the router to transport all its various attachments and so on the router itself. I routed it, and I think it was, I can't remember what it was, maybe 8 or 10 mil MDF, and this would be 20 maybe or more. I didn't actually measure it. You'll notice that the front edge cuts through the oak veneer very, very neatly in general. I mean, it's, this edge here was not a particularly good cut. But what you will probably find, the sample that I put together here isn't particularly deep. You could cut more into it if you like, make the pegs, if you want, of the dovetails themselves longer. You could do it that way. I quite like the proportions of this. I'd find much longer than that, and it would start to look a bit disproportionate. It would start to look weak. And what you may also find is that the MDF itself may give. Okay, as you hammer it, you see there's a very, very fine line there that coincides. It coincides with the top of the joint. This is just an idea. If you decide you want to veneer MDF, it works quite well with black. Imagine this was black veneered with oak. The contrast is cool, and obviously it's a lot cheaper than working with hardwoods. If you decide that you don't have the budget, or your client doesn't have the budget to work with hardwoods or even softwoods, which I don't think route even as well as, for this purpose, don't even route as well as MDF, it's something you could consider. Use a colour, veneer the wood first, and because you're cutting in, you're not cutting through the backside to produce the joint, you'll probably find if your bit is of a reasonable quality and sharp, that you're able to bite into it like this without actually destroying the front face. So, guys, thanks for watching our video. That's the PL11 by Virutex and their accompanying plunge router. But the thing with this is, this basic idea would probably work for any dovetailing jig. So if you've bought one and you find that the instructions are a little bit thin on the ground, that would be the basic idea. The key things would be, make sure that the unit itself is very, very secure. Make sure that you are working, you're clear about the depth you're cutting to, so you don't hit the base. And above all, make sure that you don't fire up the machine before it's actually solid in position, because that will probably result in you hitting the comb. Okay, all the best with your dovetailing, guys. Thanks for watching.